All right, I think we can get started. So yeah, welcome to this webinar presented by Genero. We have a really interesting topic that's very timely. I know a lot of companies are think a lot about cutting down on advertising costs, but also maximizing advertising performance. And that's exactly what we, or actually my colleague Kent, is going to talk about today. So yeah, really excited for this, and I think it's going to be very valuable for you guys. So yeah, Kent, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Kent. I work at Genero as a senior growth hacker. Nice to meet you all.
And a couple of words about Genero if you don't know us. We are one of the leading digital growth marketing agencies in the Nordics. It means we help companies from all different markets, verticals, categories, basically drive growth through digital marketing, whether that's technology, design, content, or marketing. So we've been doing this for going on 13 years, almost 14 years. 125 people today across Sweden, Finland, and also some people working around the world. And yeah, we work very broadly across B2B, B2C, e-commerce. And as I mentioned, kind of the main thing that we do is really focused on profitable, sustainable revenue growth. And yeah, so basically what we've thought about with this webinar is creating something that is mainly designed for marketers and decision makers. So anyone whose job it is to determine things related to ad budgets is going to hopefully find this useful. One thing that we really try to always do is to make it practical. So to introduce some concepts, some theoretical concepts, but also always combine that with really practical takeaways that you guys can implement yourselves. And yeah, feel free to ask questions at any point during this webinar. The chat, you can put a question in the chat, and we'll be able to answer all of those at the end in the Q&A. And as I mentioned, there's also going to be a recording that's going to be sent to you via email after the webinar is done. So you'll have that, and you can share that with colleagues if you'd like. So without further ado, the stage is yours, Kent.
Thank you. All right. Happy you all could join me on this, at least here it's sunny Wednesday day. Here to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which I think can be boiled down to basically knowing how advertising works, as you can then spend less on what is effective and more on what actually works. Less on what's ineffective and more on what actually works. But like I mentioned, we first have to understand some fundamental truths, some fundamental principles about how advertising works, so you can then, and how it doesn't work, so you can spend your resources efficiently. First, how does advertising work? It's important to know that advertising works by influencing, which means changing customer behavior, and it actually generates sales. But the goal actually generates sales. Actually, at least good advertising does. That would not have happened otherwise. This effect is found in the short term, but it's often much smaller than expected, and because it compounds, it grows larger over the long term. And this effect is often larger than you'd expect. So often the mistake that it's done is they overemphasize the short term and ignore the long term, but we'll get more into that later. Because of this fact, because the majority of the effect happens in the long term, it's actually super difficult to measure the true effect. So we expect there to be an effect on sales, on revenue, but it's hard to sort of link the two. So these are basically taken from the previous slide, the 5 points different topics that I'm going to touch on and go through in this order. So advertising drives sales. Sales that would not have happened without the advertising. There is a short-term effect, although it's smaller, but the dominant effect is the long-term one, and it's notoriously hard to measure. So these are the 5 topics that we're going to go through today. All right, first, advertising generates sales. So even though marketing, especially with digital marketing, has become more and more performance driven, there's still a lot of, I'd say, misconceptions, misunderstanding about what advertising does and what it should do. Often marketing in general and advertising specifically is often seen as only a cost center, something that you have to do. It's a cost, but doesn't have an impact on sales. In truth, like I mentioned before, it for sure does, at least when it's good advertising and advertising done correctly. So if you are spending on advertising, you should try to do your best to measure the impact of it on sales and improve based on that impact, based on what works. Do more of what works and less of what doesn't. Pretty easy in theory at least. So this is a classic marketer's funnel. We are understanding that people are not directly purchasing, but they have sort of this funnel that they go through. Because these more top of the funnel metrics are easier to measure, for example, reach, ad impressions, readers, leads, and so on, often these are what marketers focus on. I'd say that this is a mistake, at least insofar as not understanding that we only care about these sort of upper funnel metrics as long as they lead to actual sales. So this is a distinction that's maybe not super clear, but the implications of the distinction are pretty massive, since often it's easier to, or setting a goal, for example, for impressions usually means that you buy lower quality impressions. So you always have to keep track of the impact on sales so you don't go in the wrong direction and focus on lower quality upper funnel metrics. Here's a concrete example from one of our clients where we did, it's a B2B client, so we did lead generation, and we started getting more and more leads, but the quality of the leads deteriorated. And this is a good example of keeping track of not only the leads, but the quality of the leads. Here, the distinction was made between low and high quality, but traditionally this is often MQLs and SQLs. So just keeping track on the sort of lower funnel impact on your advertising, since it's often easier to generate low quality leads or low quality impressions and video views, etc. So if you only look at those metrics, you'll start to generate more lower quality traffic, and which will have a negative impact on revenue. So to conclude this point, there are a lot of low quality impressions and clicks and even leads to be bought. It's in the ad platforms and ad providers' interest to sell you as much advertising space as possible, and they don't necessarily care about the quality of the ad inventory. So if you're willing to buy, for example, if you look at video views and they can sell you really low quality video views, and you're not following the effect on sales and effect on lower funnel metrics, then they will sell you as much of the low quality inventory as you want to buy. So try to not care too much about what's sometimes called vanity metrics, for example, impressions, reach, such things, and try to really follow the effect on sort of lower funnel actions. So the solution here is to measure, of course, sales, but also good sort of hard proxies, things that are so hard to gamble with. So for example, if you're following brand awareness through customer surveys, that's a metric that's really hard to sort of play with. It's hard to falsify. So if, regardless of what you're doing, if your brand awareness is increasing, you're doing something right, and that will have an impact on the sales later on. So you don't necessarily have to only focus on sales, but try to always push for better and harder sort of points and metrics that you follow. Share of search is another one, basically following the percentage of brand searches compared to your competitors, which we found is a pretty, it's sort of good middle of the road, since it's not a revenue, but it does correlate with revenue, and it's pretty easy to follow, and you can also follow it on a pretty short-term basis. And the other point, of course, don't just put out your ads without following any metrics, but try to improve based on what you see working. And again, not just the upper funnel metrics, since that often leads you in the wrong direction, but really try to keep your eye on the ball and focus on harder proxies. All right, the next point: advertising does not just generate sales; it should generate incremental sales as well. So to illustrate the problem, what can go wrong, here are a few examples of large, sophisticated advertising spending hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising that, when it turned out that it didn't basically have any impact. When we read about these cases, we also have to understand that on the other side, there's a provider of advertising inventory that is getting this revenue. So there's a party on the other side that's interested in selling advertising to these and to you. So understanding how it works again means you don't spend on low quality advertising inventory. Yes, so what's going on here? The crux of the issue is that when it comes to measuring performance, measuring return on investment and return on ad spend, it's almost always measured wrong. Again, it's in the interest of the advertising providers for you to not understand how these should be measured, since it will mean a lot more advertising revenue for them. Here is a good illustration of how it looks in practice. This is from a great company in the US, where they compared what they saw, so the impact on revenue that they saw in their channels using attribution software, and what the performance looked like when they actually asked their customers. So if they just looked on what they saw in channels and using the attribution software, most of the revenue was sort of driven by search, so search ads and organic search. But when they asked their customers, most of the customers did not mention search, but instead said they came through and from social media and podcasts and word of mouth. The crux of the issue is basically that advertising platforms don't have a good way of measuring if the ads actually drove the sales. They just measure if they if there was a correlation there. So if someone clicked an ad and purchased, they just assumed that ad generated a purchase, but that's obviously a fundamental error. Correlation does not equal causation. So we have to find better ways to measure the impact and measure the incremental impact, meaning the sales that would not have happened without the advertising. So the mistake here is just going by what the channels are telling you. They're telling you that you got a 4x return on investment, but since they are basically measuring in a wrong way, in a fundamentally wrong way, we want to have better ways of measurement. One really practical solution here is just to deprivation test some of your channels. For example, if you're spending a lot on branded advertising, branded search, so someone is searching for a brand and you're displaying an ad there, you might try just turning off for a while to see if that revenue, if you lose that revenue completely, or if that revenue is just generated through your organic search results. Also, retargeting is something that we usually find that is really good at stealing credit. So if you're targeting a lot of your ads to people who have visited your website, chances are you're stealing a lot of credit, and a lot of those customers would already have purchased. So just know that for a lot of these channels where it seems that performance is really good, it's not because performance is that good. It's just that the platforms are stealing credit, especially well on those platforms. So you might try just turning it off for a while and see what happens. Advertising works in the short term. So basically, this is just juxtaposed to the sort of common misunderstanding that advertising only works in the long term. We're going to touch on that later on, but we see, especially when it comes, I think Google is a great example of this. A portion of the population is usually always searching for whatever you're offering. So when it comes to clothes, it might be a larger percentage. If you're B2B company, might be a really small percentage, but regardless, some number of your potential customers are always sort of switching at any moment. And that's a very effective time to advertise to them. So if you're not running search ads and there are sort of searches for a type of a product or service, that's a really easy and a good first step to take. There are, when it comes to specifically search, paid search as Google, Bing, and also of course SEO, which we see and produce a lot of value for our customers. So if you're coming from that type of background where you're only invested in your brand, this can be a really easy, it can be really low-hanging fruit for you, since the results can be generated pretty quickly. Also, one pretty practical thing that we see in work is when it comes to the short term, usually there's a portion of your customers that you don't want. So for an e-commerce store, this might be really high returning customers. So customers who buy a lot, but then return a lot. So the final impact of the customer is most likely negative, especially if you're running sort of free shipping and free returns. So this is something that can have a really massive impact on your bottom line. I saw an example of someone increasing the profit by 10% just by not advertising to their worst customers. That's a good quick win, possibly. And again, on the other hand, like I mentioned before, advertising works even better in the long term. And this is usually the trap that we see sort of more sophisticated advertisers falling into. So they know that advertising works in the short term. They're really effective in their sort of tactical campaigns. But here also we see a lot of common pitfalls by not understanding better what this means in practice and how this should drive your advertising efforts. So this is a study done by Facebook, now called Meta, about thousands of campaigns and measure the sort of overall effect of their advertising campaigns. And they divided these two into two separate categories, basically the short-term activation effects, the immediate one, and the longer term effect by sort of improving the brand awareness of the brand. As you can see, the majority of the effect actually is generated over the long term. And what's important to note here is that this is only from one campaign. So you realize that if you're running campaigns that are always on, a large part of the long-term effect is going to be captured by campaigns later on. So it might be like a part of the effect that seems to be the short-term effect is actually caused by campaigns in the past. So this long-term effect is not it's not easy to measure, it's not easy to see, but it is there, and as you can see, it dominates. If you keep your perspective, if you keep the long-term view, you know that keeping that this effect compounds, meaning it grows exponentially over time, and this is where the real magic happens. So usually we see people sort of overemphasizing what can be done with advertising in the short term, but they ignore and don't understand what can be done over time. A great example of not understanding this is overemphasizing price promotions or discounts. So usually, like I mentioned that it's really hard to drive sort of massive boosts with increases in advertising spend in the short term, and the counter to that is often that discounts work. That we've seen great results with sort of large price promotional campaigns. But usually what happens here is that you're not actually driving a larger effect. You're instead sort of taking future revenue and getting it now. That on its own would be great if it was not for the case that they're giving away free margins. So that's the crux of the issue with the discounts and price promotions, is that you're getting more revenue, but you're sort of stealing from the future, which would be great if it was not for the fact that you're usually giving away a large percentage of your margin. What this means also is that you're lowering the baseline for the future, and you're sort of teaching your customers to wait for a discounted price. So the more that you do this, the worse it gets. And at some point, no one is buying unless it's on sale. And what this means in practice, if you've gotten to this stage, it usually means that you might be thinking that your discounts are working even better because of this. But what's actually happened is that everyone is expecting the discount, so that they're waiting for that campaign to purchase. So this is something to be careful with. Now, when I mentioned the examples before, Airbnb was a great case of someone sort of spending hundreds of millions of dollars without an effect. A couple of years ago, they basically dropped everything down to zero, and still saw the traffic remain at almost the exact same level. So basically, they had spent a lot of money on advertising that was not effective and was just basically stealing credit for things that were already going to happen. Now, what they did is they took the long-term view and shifted their spend from sort of performance marketing, really short-term tactical campaigns, to brand, investing in educating the potential customers about their brand and spending for the long term. And again, this is a pretty brave move, I'd say, since it's like we're going to talk about in a moment. It's much harder to measure, but it is more effective in the long term, and they've seen great results from this since making this massive shift. One other thing to remember when it comes to, if you want to sort of capture this long-term effect, it's important to be consistent with your spending, but also consistent with your brand. This is a challenge because a lot of advertising is misattributed. Up to 80% of ads were either not attributed to the correct brand or any brand, or attributed to their competitor. So you have to have something that ensures that the sort of inventory, the advertising you're paying for, is actually being attributed to your brand. Now, for Coca-Cola, this works great. They can just use their color. You probably don't have the brand recognition Coca-Cola. So you have to be more distinct and be more wary of sort of potential customers not understanding correctly that it's your brand. Again, most of the advertising you're spending on, people are not they're spending a really short time with your ad, so they're probably scrolling right past, and only only a small percentage of people are watching more than a few seconds or clicking through the website. So just make sure that the ad itself is directly attributed to your brand. Otherwise, you either might be wasting your spend, or you might even be spending for your competitor. So to conclude this point, the common mistakes we see is sort of trying to measure performance, leading to over investing in search and ignoring the long-term brand building. Also, too aggressive discounting, since that's really easy to measure, and it has a large short-term effect. But as I mentioned before, usually this does not pay off, and it hurts your brand, and it hurts your profitability. And the third mistake, not being consistent both with your brand and with your spend. So advertising works best over the long term. So instead of trying to do these really massive campaigns and not spending for a while, it's better to be consistent, spend on a consistent basis, and keep that going for a long term. And finally, advertising is hard to measure. So we went from saying that advertising should generate sales, and you should optimize for things that are generating sales. But obviously, the main challenge here is actually measuring sales. And this is also a large reason why marketers are hesitant to really go down the route of trying to generate sales, because it's much easier to measure the impact on ad impressions or video views and software metrics like that. And it's hard because we live in a complex world. In a scientific sense, it's super hard to measure causality when it's in a complex system. When there are a lot of things happening, it might be easy to measure when two things correlate, but it's super hard to measure that one thing is driving the other. Buying journeys are complex. People are having many interactions with your brand. There are a lot of things affecting both your revenue and your marketing, and also the fact that most of the effect is spread out over time makes it really hard. Teams then that want to be sort of data-driven, teams that want to measure the impact might go down a wrong path here. So trying to if you try to go too far down the road of measuring performance, you might be hurting yourself. But first, about the sort of complexity of the buying journey. This is obviously a very simplified view, but as we can see, there are multiple touch points. Some of these are affected negatively by sort of privacy-related changes, making it even harder to track these things. But some of these are fundamentally possible to measure. Podcasts, really hard to measure. Obviously, things like word of mouth referrals are even more impossible, since it affects or it comes from in-person interactions. And what this means, obviously, often is that if you try to measure and try to optimize for things that can be measured, you sort of start to optimize towards the things that are measurable. For instance, in this example, it's Google search, and this is a good example of what I mentioned before, where you start to optimize towards the short term instead of understanding the bigger picture. and a more complex picture. What this looks like in principle is that often it's easier to measure the things that have less impact. So measuring things that happen just before the actual purchase or the actual conversion to a lead or whatever are much easier, but those touch points, those interactions are usually not as impactful on the actual conversion. So the earlier in the buying journey, the upper in the further up the funnel you can meet someone and tell them about your brand, the more likely this is to have an effect and a larger effect on the actual purchase decision. But obviously, the further away from purchase, the harder it is to measure. I had a great example of this when someone said that their perception of a brand was created by something that they have heard like 20 years ago. And this meant because of confirmation bias, basically they were much more inclined to take things, news about the company and messaging about the company in a positive light because they had that single touch point 20 years ago. And that touch point had a larger impact than basically everything that has happened since. But obviously measuring something that someone's parent or something told them 20 years ago is not even close to possible. So this is a fundamental challenge that is always going to be there and that you have to contend with. Again, there's a lot of noise in a complex world, meaning that there are a lot of things that have an impact on sales that you won't be able to ever know. So a common mistake we see with sort of data-driven teams is that they try to jump on every change in revenue. They follow a lot of metrics and they want to understand how things work, but they don't accept that there are things that they're not going to be able to know. So they usually trigger an investigation and they don't come. It doesn't lead to anything useful. What we find is helpful here is to take a bigger picture approach. So, for example, going from a daily view of revenue to a monthly or even quarterly view, usually lets you ignore the noise and sort of see the larger picture and the larger trends, which is what we're interested in anyway. So this is an example from a client of ours. Excuse me. Where looking at the daily sales, you basically can't see you can't see anything, and this is not useful. But then taking a longer view, you can see a quarterly view. You can see that even with variation, you can see that the trend for sure is positive. So ignoring noise and taking a step back and looking at the long term is super useful. This also applies to looking at given the fundamental challenges of measurement and the things that the tools we have basically not being enough or accurate enough for us to get a completely accurate picture. We can use, for example, in-channel numbers as signals, but then making sure that everything works at a P&L level. So the approach that we take is that we use, for example, return on ad spend that we see in Facebook as a signal for what works, but then we always make sure that marketing spend as a portion of revenue makes sense. So we don't sort of overemphasize. We use signals, but realizing that they're not trustworthy, we don't overemphasize the signals that we see in channels, but always try to look at a longer view, making sure that everything's moving in the right direction, and that everything makes sense on a sort of P&L level even. So with this sort of obsession over measurement, we usually see more and more money being spent on really short-term efforts and really sort of demand capture channels. Google search is a good example of this. Like I mentioned, it is effective, especially if you have, or depending on what type of service or product you're offering. But if you're only measuring sort of really short-term results, you don't see that you could be spending or should be spending much more on actually building your brand over the long term. Often the other mistake that we see is that there's so much noise in this complex world of ours that they sort of go around chasing a lot of a different sort of flukes instead of taking, again, the longer term view of things. So here there's a pretty large competitive advantage in our experience with sort of ignoring the noise, accepting that you're not going to be able to measure everything. You're not going to be able to know exactly if that campaign or this campaign is working or not. So you have to be consistent. You have to be content with not knowing everything. Not knowing everything right now, but knowing that everything is working on the long term. Also, one thing that, like I also mentioned before, is that don't just look at the numbers. Talk to your actual customers. We find that helps sort of push through the noise, and it usually gives even though it's also biased in a way, it can give you a really useful insight into what's actually happening on the ground. So here we see that sort of in a B2B setting, making sure that feedback loop between sales and marketing is connected, so you can get that feedback and from your sort of real customers. All right, to wrap this up, this is the sort of gist of it all. Understand that advertising should and will lead to incremental sales if done correctly. By understanding how advertising works and when it works, you can maximize the use of your budgets. So regardless if it's just decreasing in the places where it's not effective, or if it's increasing in the channels and efforts that are effective, this will help you produce actual results. As I mentioned before, consistently focusing on the long term and ignoring common pitfalls go a long way. So you don't have to be super advanced, as long as you can sort of use these principles to know that we're now sort of pivoting or focusing too much on the short term, for example, or we're being driven by noise. That will go a long way in helping you move forward. Especially when it comes to marketing, since we're usually too far away from the from being being responsible for driving revenue. There are a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions and things being taught in the wrong way. So I think if you can use these practical principles, it will help you actually generate results. This is just a sort of to do and to try list for you that will I think will be a pretty helpful next step. So there are things that you should definitely do. So we know that you should be distinct in your advertising. We should be consistent over time. You should invest in your brand. You should ignore noise, etc. But then when it comes to things that we've often see are overemphasized, we're not saying that you should completely ignore branded search, for example, or completely not do retargeting. Just that you should consider that these are not maybe as impactful as you might believe, and you should be careful with them, and you can even try sort of not doing them at all. So for example, deprivation testing, again, is just shutting it off and seeing what happens. Testing that with your branded search ads can be a really effective and fast way to see that you're spending a lot on advertising that is having no effect. So some of these are sort of really quick wins, potentially low-hanging fruit that you can implement right away and either get your money back to spending in more effective channels, or then to spend more, or just to know where you should spend more, basically. All right, that was it for the presentation so far. I think we're going to go to questions now.
And just to point out, I added a couple of links in the comment section to some of the stuff that, like more details on some of the stuff that Ken talked about, discounting, measurement, etc. So you can save those links and check it out. There's a blog post, a webinar, and a LinkedIn post where you can get some more information. But yeah, if you have any questions, we'd love to answer those.
Yeah, feel free to drop any questions in the chat. Otherwise, if you don't have any questions at the moment, you can always send them to us or to me later on as well. We put out a lot of content regarding these topics, so also good to check out the blog, Genero's blog.
Yeah, and if you're not following us on LinkedIn, make sure to do that as well. That's typically where we share all of the webinars, blog posts, podcasts that we have coming up. We have one webinar coming up in a week talking about e-commerce advertising and how to use marketing to maximize e-commerce profitability. But yeah, there was a question from Joel, so go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I have been contending with this a lot this year. The obvious pro of fixed budget is that it's much simpler. So you don't have to make decisions. You don't have to have a framework. You can it's basically just set it and forget it. The negative, the con of fixed budget is obviously you don't get to react on the things that work. So I think dynamic budgets, if you can do it, is for sure the best way to do it. Obviously, with the challenges of measurement, it makes it not super easy. But we actually have, I think we have it on the blog post, but we have sort of a pretty easy framework for how you can make sure that everything makes sense. So basically, how we do it in a nutshell is that we have sort of limits based on revenue, based on ad spend as a portion of revenue, and then we use in-channel signals to make the actual adjustments. So, for example, if we see really good results in Facebook, we can raise the spend up to a certain level, then set on advertising as a portion of revenue. Do we have that, Josh, as a blog post somewhere?
Well, we have so Joel, you can check out the webinar link that I posted in the chat. That's going to go a bit into detail on, well, it talks about measurement, but you can use that framework to for your dynamic budgeting. And I would just throw my 2 cents in that, like Ken said, dynamic budgeting is the better, superior alternative, but it requires a really good understanding of, it requires measurement, right? So for instance, if you're basing your dynamic budgeting on customer acquisition costs, then obviously you need to be able to track that, and you need to have a sense of what the threshold, what the limit is. And very few companies have that. So very few companies are able to do dynamic budgeting because they don't have the information and visibility into the business. If they have that, then but dynamic budgeting is superior. We had a question from Malina. What is the best way to measure Facebook ROAS from your point of view, considering that the stats are not 100% accurate? Yes, they're definitely not 100% accurate. So how do we get around that, Kent?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think first understanding that it won't be accurate is the starting point. So we're not gonna get that it's 4.21x return on ad spend. So embracing that ambiguity. The second thing is that everything it depends a bit on your company maturity. So it's much easier in a case where you have when you have a large portion of your budgets going to Facebook, then you can be content with sort of if ad spend goes up and revenue goes up, you're sort of there's that implication of causality there. So you look at if you're spending more, is revenue going up, regardless of if you can track it somewhere, then that's a good case. For more mature businesses where advertising is maybe, or Facebook specifically is not driving sales to the same extent, there are solutions like MMM, for example, which is advanced statistical modeling, but that's a more complex technical solution they probably gonna need help with. So the most practical advice I think for most companies, regardless of their size, is sort of combining what you see in channels with actually asking your customers. So questions like where did you hear about us is a good sort of reality check on what you're seeing in numbers in channels. So if Facebook is reporting that all of the revenue is coming from their ads, but none of your customers are mentioning it, then it might be, it works as a good reality check on where you're seeing.
And to just add one more practical kind of thing is to, when it comes to Facebook, you want to make sure that the number of conversions that are coming from view through attribution, so people who see an ad but they don't click on it, that should be very small, because we've seen cases where it's 50%. So you have this very inflated ROAS coming from Facebook because they're showing a bunch of ads to people who are bound to purchase regardless. Like, it's not incremental revenue. So you can go and look at that specifically and make sure that you're optimizing for and you're only considering like click-through attribution, because that's much more likely to be relevant. So for some companies, just making that switch can completely change their reported ROAS and give them a much better sense of what's actually happening.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
another practical tip. I usually try to control the spend that goes to retargeting. So you try to make sure that you have at least a portion of the budget that goes through to people who have not engaged in your with your brand in any way. So you can be sort of more sure that these are actually incremental conversions that are coming from these customers. So if someone has been on the site already, I try to sort of split the spend between those who have interacted with your brand and not interacted with your brand, if it's possible.
So Daniel asked a good question. How to do advertising for B2B complicated product with very long sales cycle, 1 year? How do you persuade top management to invest in ads when it's hard to measure the results?
Yeah, another great question. The first thing is obviously to understand that the longer the sales cycle, the longer also the feedback cycle. So it's going to take longer for you to know what works, and you have to sort of just accept that. If the consideration phase is a week, you're going to get much more iterations and much more. You're going to be able to test much more in a smaller amount of time, and you're going to know much faster what actually works. So that's the first thing. I think otherwise, it's not necessarily that different from other things. You still got to do great advertising. You still got to focus on the brand. You still got to do basically everything else. It's just mostly just accepting that the feedback cycle is going to be longer, in my opinion.
I think you touched upon something really important in the question, which is when it comes to measuring the results from the ads. And that's, you need to have a conversation with the management about how to measure success. Because if your view is that success requires these different measurements from quantitative data through attribution combined with qualitative data that we get from customers, and that becomes the reality. If management doesn't agree on that, then you'll never be able to align, and you'll never be able to have a to be able to do any successful long-term marketing. So making sure that you're on the same page, but when it comes to measuring what success looks like. And then I would say you need to get that commitment from management that 1 year might be a bit too long, but let's say 3 to 6 months for whatever kind of strategy you're implementing. It could be LinkedIn, it could be podcast, could be blog posts, ebooks, whatever it is. To get that commitment that you think you need, time commitment and budget commitment. And if you're not able to do that, if you're not able to get that commitment from the management team, then basically they're not giving you, they're not setting you up for success. And then you need to have a hard conversation about the fact that, the way they're thinking about marketing is not actually helping you do your job. So it really, before you move into any of the tactical stuff, it's more about an organizational communication problem, making sure that you have a similar, you have the same view of success, and you're able to actually get that commitment so you can focus and you can do the job without every week have to explain why we're not seeing this huge increase in leads, even though we're doing all these things in marketing. And that's basically how we at Genero are approaching this as well. A lot of the content that we do, this webinar being an example, is not something that we're not going to measure only the short-term effects of it. It's a part of our longer-term strategy of building our brand and thought leadership.
Yeah, I think managing expectations is key. That's basically the gist of it. Some people think that advertising should be able to, or that the effect should be so strong in the short term, you're just gonna sort of turn up the budget and everything is gonna go up. Like we mentioned this in this webinar, it's not as simple. So making sure that they have the correct expectations when it comes to on what time scale are these results going to materialize.
And as you said, like in the question, how do you persuade? Well, arguments, facts and data. So finding examples of companies that are doing that, using some of the examples that we had or Kent showed in this webinar, I think that can be really powerful to show them, because there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of ignorance about how marketing works, and you may need to kind of educate internally before you're able to really set yourself up for success.
Yeah, exactly. And since there are a lot of advertisers spending on basically ineffective advertising, I think the top management being careful to invest in that it's justified. So I think if you understand how things work, if you have a great case for other companies also having proven results, I think you have a great starting point.
We got a couple more minutes if anyone has any further questions. If not, like Ken said, you can reach out to glad to hear. If Ken said, like Ken said, you can reach out to him on LinkedIn or email if you have any further questions. This is kind of, as Ken mentioned at the beginning, this is one of his favorite topics, and you can go very, very, very deep into this. And what we talked about here is kind of just scratching the surface, and try to keep it very broad. Obviously, all these things need to be applied specifically to your different businesses, and there's a lot of things to consider there. So, Eva, there's the video. The link to this recording is going to be emailed to you afterwards, and we will also upload it to our YouTube channel. So, absolutely. All right. I think we're going to wrap it up. You're welcome.
Yeah.
I think we're going to wrap it up here. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Kent, for presenting. And wish you all happy, good rest of the day.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Take care.